Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. A couple of days ago I uploaded a video in which I talk about presentism, a position in the philosophy of time. And in this video I am going to look at another article that is about presentism, a position in the philosophy of time. And this time it's an article written by Jesse Mulder, a Dutch philosopher. It was published in 2017 and it's called Two Fundamentally Different Perspectives on Time. Now, in a moment, I'm going to talk about what Mulder does in this article and how he wants to sort of reshape the discussion in the philosophy of time. But before we do that, both as an introduction and as a sort of context for Mulder's intervention in the debate, I want to give you sort of a standard way of thinking about presentism and eternalism, these two opposed positions in the philosophy of time. So here's the standard way of thinking about eternalism. Eternalism is the claim that past, present, and future are all equally real. We should think of the world as a four-dimensional whole. So there's not just the three dimensions of space, there's also the fourth dimension of time, and that entire four-dimensional entity, that is the world, right? And so, of course, we make a distinction between past, present, and future, but that is on a par with our making the distinction between here and there, or between left and right maybe. So let's take here and there. When I say that I'm here, or that this place is here, I'm just pointing out that it's the place where I am, right? And it doesn't have any other metaphysical meaning. It's not that the here is more real than the there or something like that, right? That doesn't make sense. And the eternalist wants to think of the difference between now and past and future along the same lines. The now, the present, is just not the place where I happen to be at, but the time that I happen to be at. And the past and the future are just, the other parts of time, the other parts of the timeline, as I call them from this particular position. But there's no metaphysically important distinction here. Right? The present is not more real than the past or the future. It's not the case that the past is already fixed and the future is open or uncertain. That's all of that is not true. There's no metaphysical distinction between those different times. So that's eternalism. And now here's a standard way of defining presentism. It is to say that presentism shrinks this eternalist universe because it says that the past and the future are not real. Only the present is real, right? So you take the eternalist four-dimensional universe, you say, yeah, but most of that is unreal. The only thing that's real is the present. And it's this one moment, this one little slice, this three-dimensional slice of the four-dimensional world, that is reality. And so that is what the presentism claims, what the presentist claims. At some point in his article, Mulder is going to call this negative presentism because it's defined in terms of what is not real. Right? You take the eternalist picture and you say, well, some parts of that are not real. And so what you're left with is only the present, and that is negative presentism. And one of the things that Mulder is going to do is he is going to argue that that is a really terrible way of defining presentism if you want to capture the kind of thought that presentists usually take themselves to be defending. Right? So if you want to capture the kind of thoughts about time that presentists usually sort of see as their own basic intuitions or ideas, then defining presentism in the way that negative presentism does is terrible, according to Mulder. And so, what the article does is basically explain why that is the case and how we should reshape our debates, our discussions, our definitions of the positions in the philosophy of time if we want to get a real, serious and good debate going. So, how does that work? Well, here is what Mulder says in the introduction. And I think it's some of these phrases are already quite complicated. And in a sense, the whole of my video is going to be an attempt to understand the way that Mulder characterizes like the good kind of perspective or the good kind of presentist perspective on time that he wants to sort of elucidate in his talk. So, here are the two perspectives. The first perspective on time that Mulder defines is what he calls a conception that can be characterized as geometrical in nature, time is understood as a dimension of reality that provides locations for reality's inhabitants in much the same way that spatial dimensions do. And this is basically the picture that I've been talking about right now as the picture of eternalism, right? The world is four-dimensional, so it's an arena, both spatial and temporal, in which objects can be placed or in which events can be placed, and so on and so forth. And so if I say that, well, there's an object in reality, and somebody says where, really what I have to do is I have to give its place, but also its time, right? I have to give four-dimensional coordinates in order to sort of fix the position of an object in the world. So that's the first way of thinking about time. Time is geometrical in nature. It's akin to a location or a dimension along which things can be located. Here is the second way of thinking about time. And again, I'm going to quote Mulder. The second conception takes time to be a sui generis form of being, or, as I will say, a formal concept characterizing a sui generis form of predication. I'm gonna say that again, that last phrase, and then I'm going to, well, basically spend the rest of the video getting us to a point where we understand what Mulder means by this and why this makes sense as a way of characterizing a perspective on time or a way of thinking about time. So, to repeat the phrase, according to the second conception, what time is it is a formal concept characterizing a sui generis, that is an on its own and having its own nature, a unique form of predication. Okay, so let's think about that. Predication. What is predication? Well, predication is a logical term, right? It's about the structure of statements or thoughts or propositions or something like that. And when we talk about predication in philosophy, we usually think about the kind of predication that was, well, discovered is maybe not the right word, but sort of described, formalized, made popular by Fregean. And so Mulder actually starts his article after these introductory definitions by talking about Frege and by talking about the way that Frege thinks about predication. So, how does Frege think about predication? Well, basically what you have is this. You have a concept, and a concept has a certain number of open places that have to be filled in with objects of the maybe appropriate kind. So, I might have the concept red, and this concept red may have one open place where I have to fill in an object. And so I could fill in my pen, and I have red applying to my pen, or as we would usually say it, my pen is red. Right? My pen is red is a way of saying that this concept, red, applies to this object, my pen. Okay, that's this thing. And you can have other forms of predication, or not other forms of predication, but you can have other predicates that are like red in that, you know, they have open places on which you put objects, but unlike red in that they have more than one place. So, for instance, the predicate uses, right, or owns. Let's take owns. Owns has probably two open places. One for a person and one for something that they own. And so I could have Victor owns the pen, right? Victor owns the pen. There's the owns, that's the predicate, and I add two items to it, me and the pen, in order to have this sentence or thought or proposition or whatever that says that I own the pen. Okay, now it's crucial for these like Fregean thoughts that they are, so to speak, a-temporal. Right? If a Fregean thought, if a Fregean predication is true, it's true. That's it, right? There's no, in our understanding of the logic of this, there's no time involved. And so, if I say that the pen is red, that is supposed to be an a-temporal statement. And if I say Victor owns the pen, that is supposed to be an a-temporal statement, on a par with statements like 2 + 2 is 4, right? Which is also an a-temporal statement. Or 3 is a prime number. That's also an a-temporal statement. So on this Fregean conception of predication, of how thinking works, how logic works, how language works, true statements or true thoughts or true propositions or whatever our preferred terminology is, are atemporal. Time has nothing to do with them. That doesn't mean that we can't talk about time, and it also doesn't mean that we can talk about things that can change, but we have some work to do, okay, in order to make that happen. And I'll talk a little bit about how to do that work in a couple of minutes. So that's one way of thinking about predication. Now, Mulder brings in a second way of thinking about predication, which is how we usually, talk about temporal things. Because how we usually talk about temporal things is not in an atemporal manner, right? Because, I say that the pen is red. Well, I don't think that this pen is going to change color anytime soon. So let me say that I own this pen, but, I'm going to give it away tomorrow. And then tomorrow, it won't be true that I own this pen. Right? Is that a contradiction? I own this pen is true, and I don't own this pen is also true? Oh, of course it's not a contradiction, because I own this pen like now, and I won't own this pen in the future, right? And tomorrow I can basically express those same thoughts by saying, well, I owned the pen in the past tense, but I don't own it now, right? I do not own it now in the present tense. And so this type of predication is temporal. It's supposed to express temporal facts that change as time goes on, right? And present tense facts become past tense facts, and future tense facts become present tense facts, and so on and so forth. So that's, at least at first sight, a different type of predication, right? And it seems that if I want to say something true when I say Victor owns the pen, I ought to be using that second type of predication, that temporal kind of predication, and not the atemporal kind of predication of Fregean. However, things are not so simple. And here is actually where things get interesting. And here is where Mulder explains to us how he sees the basic shape of the debate in the philosophy of time, or the basic shape that the debate in the philosophy of time should have. Because this is the basic shape. The basic question, according to Mulder, is about the relation between these two types of predication, between this atemporal Fregean predication and this temporal kind of predication that we seem to use in everyday language. What eternalists have traditionally wanted to defend is a way of thinking about the relation between these two things where temporal predication can be reduced to atemporal predication. So the only thing that we really need is atemporal predication, Fregean predication, and any tensed statements or any statements that seem to involve time can in fact be expressed, can be understood in terms of this atemporal predication. How? Well, it might actually seem pretty simple. Today is, let me check it out, it is the 16th of December 2022. So what a reduction of my seemingly temporal claim, or maybe really temporal claim, that I own the pen, right? What a reduction of that into Fregean predication might look like is to say, I own the pen on December 16, 2022. Right? It's not I own the pen, sort of that is literally true, because tomorrow that will be false, and something can't, like a fact can't be both true and false on the Fregean, or on this Fregean conception. But there's another fact, and this is the real thing that I express when I say I own the pen, and it is I own the pen on the 16th of December 2022. And here's another true fact, which is that I won't, or I do not own the pen on the 17th of December 2022. Right? So what I do in this case is I reduce the temporal predication, like I own the pen, that I say now, I don't own the pen, that I say tomorrow. I reduce them to atemporal predication by arguing basically that owning doesn't need two objects. Owning doesn't need just somebody who owns it and the thing that it owns, that person owns. Owning needs three things, right? Owning is a relation between somebody who owns something, something that is owned, and a time at which the owning takes place. And this is something that, like somebody who has a reductive story, about how temporal predication relates to atemporal predication, we'll say in general, right? Whenever time seems to crop up in how we talk, what we really need to do is we need, in one way or another, and I've just given you one way of doing it, in one way or another, bring time within the atemporal predication. For instance, by saying that an event didn't just happen, it happened at some time, this or that time. Or saying that this relation doesn't just obtain, but it obtains between me and the thing and the time. Right? That's the way that a reductive story about temporal predication works. So, against this, the traditional presentist who thinks that, that doesn't really capture the nature of time, should hold that temporal predication is something that you can't reduce. Right? You can't get rid of it, or you can't sort of express everything that it expresses by turning it into these atemporal statements. And so now we can maybe read again the phrase that Mulder used in the beginning of the article, namely that the second conception takes time to be a sui generis, that is non-reducible, right? You need to keep it, you can't get rid of it by reducing it to something else, a sui generis form of predication, right? It's just a different way of saying that some property applies to some being, some object, right? So according to this second way of looking at time, when I say something like 3 is prime, and when I say something like I own the pen, these are two different forms of saying something, two different forms of predication. They're in a sense really two different is's. Right? One is an atemporal is, and 3 is prime in no way implies that in the future it will be true that 3 was prime. That doesn't even make sense. Whereas I own the pen definitely implies that in the future it will be true that I owned the pen. Right? And so, there are different logical implications here. On the second conception of time, this must mean that there are actually different thoughts being expressed here, different ways of expressing thought, different forms of predication, as Mulder calls it. Okay, so what does Mulder do next? Mulder wants to show how a kind of presumption, that's maybe the word I'm looking for, a kind of presumption in favor of Fregean atemporal predication runs through the philosophy of time. And he says, well, that makes sense for some positions in the philosophy of time, right? If you think that everything should be expressed in these atemporal phrases, then really the kind of world that you're sort of thinking of is this four-dimensional eternalist world where everything just timelessly is, and so you're going to be an eternalist, and it's going to be a world where, that something is or was. That's really not fundamental. The only fundamental thing is that something is at some temporal distance from something else, like this happened one day before that, and that happened one day before that. Those are the objective temporal facts. But that something is or was or will be the case, that's just a matter of perspective. That's not really like metaphysically real. And that means that, and I'm just going to throw out this term and not really talk about it. That means that you're a B-theorist. So you're an eternalist and a B-theorist, someone who thinks that was, is, and will be are not really metaphysically fundamental. And probably you're going to be a so-called perdurantist. Somebody who believes that objects, not just the world, but objects are four-dimensional too, right? This pen looks three-dimensional, but that's because we're forgetting that it's also spread out in time. And so really it's a four-dimensional thing. Okay, and so we get several familiar positions in the philosophy of time when we start with Fregean predication as the only basic sort of metaphysically real type of predication. But, Mulder goes on, these supposed opposites of these positions in the philosophy of time. So against eternalism there is presentism, and against the B theory there is the A theory, which says that was, is, and will be, that these tenses are fundamental. And against perdurantism, which says that objects are spread out in time, There is endurantism, which says that objects are not spread out in time, like this three-dimensional thing, that's my pen, not some four-dimensional thing. So there are these opposed positions, presentism, a-theory, endurantism, and they are supposed to capture another way of thinking about time. But, Mulder argues, they fail to do so. They fail to do so because almost everyone who defends them, almost everyone who even formulates them, takes Fregean predication as the one basic form of predication. And so they try to formulate these theories that are supposed to be an alternative in a language that doesn't really allow them to formulate it. And I won't go into a lot of detail here, but Mulder goes into a lot of detail for both endurantism and the a-theory and presentism to show how they fail to capture what they want to capture about time, its dynamic nature, its movement, so to speak, how they fail to capture that precisely because they are beholden to, or they are locked into, this form of this Fregean form of predication. And I just want to mention one example of that, which is okay. So there is an attempt to capture this idea of the movement of time, which is called the moving spotlight theory. And so the moving spotlight theory says, okay, there's this privileged moment, the present, right? That's what the presentist probably wants to say, something like that. There's this privileged moment, the present. But that doesn't really do anything, right? I mean, I can have a privileged moment, the present, but it's just there, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to be moving yet. I mean, and I want it to sort of move, right? I mean, I want there to be some kind of direction from the past to the future, and just saying that there is a privileged moment doesn't do that. So I need a spotlight, something that shines on one part of my four-dimensional world, and to say, well, that's the real present. But then it also needs to move. It needs to move, right? And so I need a moving spotlight. And the strange thing is that I can formulate like everything I want in terms of these temporal facts about things that are, things that were, things that will be. So I can say, well, at this moment of the world, it is the case that Victor is making a video. It was the case that Victor read Jesse Mulder's article. And it will be the case that Victor tells to Jesse Mulder, hey, I've made a video about your article. So all that is there. So I have a was, I have an is, and I have a will be. And it doesn't do anything. Right? I have all these temporal statements, but by themselves they don't imply that anything is changing. And that's weird. Right? Because it should be the case, we think, at least on this sort of second way of thinking about time, this non-eternalist way of thinking about time, that time is dynamic. And that when we say that something is the case, we are at the same time thinking that it therefore is going to be the case that it was the case, and it was the case that it was going to be the case, and sort of this very idea of movement seems implicit in the very idea of a temporal thought, of temporal predication. But it's not there. And that's what Mulder shows in like the bulk, the main part of the article. It's not there in all these attempts to define presentism, a-theory, endurantism. They are all impotent. They never capture the dynamic aspect of time that they are supposed to capture. And so I think this is a very nice quote by Mulder near the end of the article. He says, well, it's 2/3 along the way. He says, and this is what somebody who follows the second conception of time would say. He says, it lies in the very form of temporal truths that they recede into the past. It lies in the very form of temporal truths that they recede into the past. It's this difference that I mentioned between saying that 3 is prime, which has absolutely no temporal connotations, and saying that I own the pen, or that I am sitting, like Victor is sitting. Well, it lies in the very nature of that claim, that it will recede into the past, and that it will be the case, in fact it already is the case, that I was sitting 10 seconds ago. And it's going to be the case a year from now that I was sitting a year ago. Right? That's already there in the very claim that Victor is sitting. And so this very claim comes with time as something that is dynamic. That at least is the claim that this people who follow this second, who have this second way of thinking about time, want to make. And basically the theories in the literature fail to make it, right? They fail to capture that truth. And again, what Mulder does in the bulk of the article is he shows in a lot of detail how that failure manifests in different theories. And I'm not going to attend to that. Okay, so in the end, Mulder starts talking about presentism specifically. He defines this idea of negative presentism, right, which is really just you take eternalism and then you say, well, the present is this little part. And it's, as I said, completely static. So it's another example of something that fails to capture what we really wanted to say about time. And he ends with some very brief remarks about what could be a positive presentism. The aim of the article is not to defend or define or work out positive presentism. It's to show what positive presentism could be. And of course, positive presentism is going to be a theory of time that takes seriously precisely the fact that Mulder announced at the beginning as the second perspective, that takes seriously the idea that time is a formal concept. That is the concept of a form of what? Well, a form of predication, a form of saying things about things that is sui generis on its own and that can't be reduced to the kind of a-temporal predication that is standard in at least the type of analytic philosophy that has been so strongly influenced by Fregean. I think, but that's my own take on this, and Mulder and I are definitely in a minority here at the moment. I think that Mulder is exactly right. So I think that he's exactly right that most of these contemporary attempts to define positions in the philosophy of time fail to get to grips with the real issue, and that Mulder's story about these two forms of predication is at least one way of a relatively linguistic way, but that's one way to do it. One way of getting into view what the real issue is in the philosophy of time. And I also happen to agree with Mulder that it's the second kind of perspective on time that is the right kind of perspective on time. So I'm pretty much in the same boat. And in fact, he pointed out that he had written this article to me when he attended a talk I gave in which I said a lot of the same things that he said here, except that he said them 5 years earlier. So that's nice, actually. I think it's nice if you find out that you have a lot in common with other people and can talk to them and can profit from what they've thought. And so I hope to work this out more in an article in the future, and then I'll no doubt talk about that too. But for now, I'll leave you with the thoughts of Jesse Mulder and this idea that maybe we should think about time as something that really describes a form of predication, a form of saying things about things or ascribing things to things. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed the video. And until next time.